Have you ever had that feeling of realizing something is wrong, but not being able to explain exactly what? Now imagine sitting in a cold room with two people looking directly at you, knowing more about your life than you'd like. And even so, you still try to lie. This is the story of a young woman, just 18 years old, who walked into a room believing she would walk out free, but left with her life completely destroyed. And the scariest part, it wasn't what she did. It was the exact moment she realized there was no way out. It all begins with an apparently ordinary image, a young girl, calm appearance, soft tone of voice, someone who at first glance could be anyone, someone you might not even notice passing by on the street, but inside that room, every word she said was being analyzed, every pause, every breath, every glance. And even before she opened her mouth, the detectives already knew everything. Still, they let her talk. And that changes the game completely. Because when someone lies, it's not just what they say that matters, it's how they say it. Right at the beginning of the conversation, she seems calm, but it's not a natural calm. It's that forced calm of someone desperately trying to appear innocent. They ask simple questions, basic things, name, age, routine, nothing threatening, nothing direct. But there's an important detail here. The detectives aren't asking because they don't know. They're asking to see if she lies. And she lies, several times. Small lies, almost imperceptible, but enough, because every answer she gives is already being compared with concrete evidence. And then comes the first crack. They mention the trip, Colorado. She responds normally, without hesitation. But something changes when they start talking about a specific city, Loveland. She says she doesn't remember. And at that moment, the silence speaks louder than any word, because not remembering something common is normal, but not remembering something specific raises a red flag. And the detectives notice. They don't press, not yet. Instead, they change the subject, and that's when she makes one of her biggest mistakes. They start talking about weapons, casually, almost like any ordinary conversation, and she relaxes. That was the mistake, because suddenly, the girl who didn't know anything starts describing weapons with impressive precision. Models, calibers, technical details. She speaks naturally, like someone who knows a lot. And in that moment, everything changes, because now she's no longer just someone confused. She's someone hiding something, and the detectives know it. But still, they remain patient. They let her talk, and the more she talks, the more she reveals herself. That's what makes this kind of interrogation so powerful. It's not about pressure, it's about waiting until the person themselves contradicts their own story. And she does exactly that. She tries to minimize her knowledge, says she learned from her fiancé, that she doesn't know much, but that directly conflicts with the level of detail she demonstrates. And that contradiction is a crack, small but enough. Now the detectives have what they need. They don't need to prove anything anymore. They just need to show it. And that's exactly what they do, calmly, without raising their voices, without directly accusing. They simply say, "We saw your car," and in that instant, something changes on her face. It's subtle, but it's there, the kind of reaction you can't fake, because when someone mentions something you know is true, the body reacts before the mind. She tries to hold on to the story, says she doesn't remember, says she wasn't there. But now, it doesn't matter anymore, because the lie has already been identified, and when one lie falls, all the others are at risk. So they move forward, one more step, more direct now. They describe the car, specific details, things only someone who actually saw it would know. And in that moment, reality starts closing in around her. She still tries to resist, still tries to deny, But her confidence is no longer the same. Her voice changes, her rhythm changes, and most importantly, silence starts to appear. And silence, in an interrogation, is never a good sign, because silence is the moment when the mind races, trying to find a way out that no longer exists. And even so, she continues, keeps denying, keeps saying she doesn't know, keeps trying to escape. But then comes the moment that defines everything. The detectives mention the video. And it's not a threat, it's not pressure, it's certainty. They have the video, they have the car, they have the evidence. And now, she knows it. And in that exact instant, everything starts to fall apart. There comes a moment when a lie simply can't hold up anymore, no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you want to believe it. The truth starts to show through the cracks. And that's exactly what happened there. When the detectives mention the video, it's not just information, it's a point of no return. Because now, it's no longer about maybe, it's about we saw it. And that changes everything. She still tries to stand her ground, says she doesn't remember, says she doesn't know. But now there's a problem. She knows that they know. And when two people know the same truth, the lie becomes unsustainable. The detectives continue, calm, controlled, unhurried. And that's not by accident, because the calmer they remain, the more pressure she feels. They begin reconstructing the scene, step by step, as if they're drawing that night, right in front of her. The car, the city, the time, the movement, and then they say what really happened. Gunshots, people on the street, an attack coming from inside the car. And at that moment, the air changes completely, because until then, she could still pretend she didn't understand. But now, there's no way around it. They're not asking, they're stating. And there's a huge difference between those two things. Questions leave room to escape. Statements don't. She responds, but not with explanations, with denial. I don't know. I don't know anything. And those words start repeating again and again and again. But there's something curious about that. The more someone says, I don't know, the more it feels like they're hiding something, because not knowing doesn't explain anything. And the detectives see that clearly. They don't confront her aggressively. They do something far more effective. They offer her a way out, a justification. Maybe someone provoked it. Maybe it was self-defense. Maybe it was a mistake. They practically hand her an opportunity to explain herself. But she doesn't take it. She keeps saying she doesn't know. And that's when things get worse. Because when you refuse a way out, what's left is responsibility. The detectives then bring in more details. The weapon, the caliber, the way it was used. They mention something very specific, an attachment that improves accuracy at night. And that's not random. It's strategic, because they know she understands weapons. And when they say that, it's like they're speaking directly. We know that you know. And in that moment, her silence becomes heavier. Because now, any answer can incriminate her, and any silence can too. They continue, and then reveal something even more important. Someone was hit, survived, but was hit. And that completely changes the weight of the situation, because now it's no longer just a reckless act. It's something far more serious, much more real, much harder to ignore. They explain where, how, precise details. And they do it almost clinically, no emotion, no judgment, just facts. And that's what makes it even more unsettling, because when someone describes something this serious with that much calm, it becomes impossible to pretend it didn't happen. She keeps denying it, but now the denial doesn't convince anyone. Not them, not the people watching, and maybe not even herself. Then comes another blow, quiet but devastating. They ask about her bag, a simple question, direct, almost innocent, and she answers, yes, there's a gun. And that's the moment everything truly starts to collapse. Because now, we're no longer talking about something distant, something from days ago. We're talking about something she has with her, right there at that moment. They ask the caliber. She answers, 9mm. And suddenly, everything connects. The shell casings found, the weapon used, the type of ammunition. Everything starts forming a complete picture, and she realizes it. But what's most striking is what comes next. She tries to defend herself, says that gun doesn't match, that it's not the same one, that it won't line up. And without realizing it, she makes an even bigger mistake. She mentions another gun, a third one that until then hadn't even been brought up. And in that instant, she hands over another piece without anyone asking. That's the effect of psychological pressure. You try to save yourself and end up sinking deeper. The detectives catch it immediately. Now they have more information, more connections, more control. And then they ask the most important question so far. Did you pull the trigger? And the world seems to stop for a second, because that question divides everything. Before and after. She answers, no, firmly. But that firmness no longer carries the same weight. Because now, it's not just about who pulled the trigger, it's about who was there, who participated, who allowed it. And the detectives make that clear. Even if she wasn't the one who fired, she can still be held responsible. And that is devastating, because it removes the last possible escape. There's no more, it wasn't me. There's only, you were there. And at that point, fear finally shows itself, not hidden, not controlled, but real, raw, visible. She tries to resist, but her voice isn't the same. Her body doesn't respond the same. And her mind is already starting to accept it. It's over. And then she asks for a lawyer. And when that happens, everything ends. Because that's the official moment when the conversation stops and reality begins. The detectives stop. They respect it, but they also make it clear what comes next. She's under arrest. No possibility of leaving at that moment, and she'll be taken back to face the consequences. And there, sitting in that room, for the first time, she truly understands. It's no longer a scare, no longer a doubt, no longer a chance to explain. It's the end of the line. There is a kind of silence that isn't just the absence of sound. It's the silence of realization, that moment when everything slows down and it finally hits you. And for her, that moment came too late. Just a few minutes earlier, she still believed she could walk out of there, that maybe it was all a misunderstanding, that maybe it could be explained, that maybe it wasn't that serious. But now, she's handcuffed, sitting, no control, no way out, and for the first time, no story left. Because every version she tried to build simply didn't hold up, and that raises an important question. At what point did everything go out of control? Because none of this starts in that room. It starts long before. It starts with small decisions, small choices, things that seem insignificant, but added together lead exactly here. A trip, a car, just another night, and one decision that changed everything. According to what was reconstructed that night, a group of people were on the street. Vulnerable people, trying to get through one more night, not bothering anyone, not posing any threat, just existing. And then a car passes by. Nothing unusual, until from inside that car, something happens, something fast, impulsive, and impossible to take back. Gunshots, and in seconds, the lives of several people change. One of them hit. He survives, but that doesn't reduce the weight. Because what defines the severity isn't just the outcome, it's the intention. And that's what makes this case so disturbing, because there was no argument, no confrontation, no clear threat, just a moment, a choice, and an action that could never be undone. And that's exactly what the detectives were trying to understand. Why? That's the central question. Not just what happened, but why did it happen? Because understanding the motive is what separates a mistake from something much deeper. But she never answers. Or maybe she can't. Because sometimes, not even the person who does it fully understands. And that's even more frightening. Now go back to the room. She's there. Her eyes aren't the same anymore. Her posture has changed. The confidence is gone. And in its place, there's something much more human. Fear. But not just any fear. Real fear. The kind that comes when you realize you no longer have control over what happens next. Because up until then, she was still playing, answering, denying, trying. But now, the game is over. And when the game is over, reality steps in. And reality doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about excuses, doesn't care about versions. It just happens. And what comes next is something a lot of people don't think about. The consequences. Because when the door to that room opens, it's not just a hallway on the other side. It's a new path. A path with no return. She'll be taken, processed, transferred, and eventually judged. And every step of that is a constant reminder that that night never ended. It continues every day, in every decision, in every consequence. And maybe the hardest part of all is accepting that. Because accepting means admitting, and admitting means facing it. But there's something even deeper here, something beyond the crime, beyond the investigation, beyond the story itself. There's a break in expectation, because when you look at her, you don't see someone you would expect in this situation, and that's unsettling, because it forces us to question something much bigger. What leads an ordinary person to do something like this? Is it influence, impulse, environment, or is it something that was always there waiting for the right moment? These questions don't have simple answers, and maybe they never will, but they matter, because they show that stories like this aren't as distant as they seem. They don't happen only in isolated places or with different people. They happen with real people in real situations, and that makes everything more uncomfortable, because it breaks the illusion of safety. The idea that this would never happen near me, but it could. And that's the point no one likes to face. Now think about this. If that video didn't exist, if that camera hadn't been there, what would have happened? Would she be in that room, or would she be living her life normally, as if nothing had happened? That's one of the most unsettling parts, because it shows how sometimes the difference between getting caught and not is just a detail, a single detail. And that doesn't change what was done, but it changes everything about the consequences. And that's why this case draws so much attention. It's not just about what happened. It's about the moment everything was revealed, the moment the truth surfaced with no room to escape, and most importantly, the moment she realized it. Because there is a specific second when everything changes, not when she's arrested, not when she's accused, but when she understands for real, and that moment is visible in her eyes, in her expression, in the silence. It's the instant when the mind finally says, it's over. And no matter what comes next, nothing can be undone. There's something about this case that goes beyond what happened that night. It's not just about the act, it's about what comes after, because many stories end at the moment of arrest, but the truth is, that's when everything really begins. After the doors close, after the silence of a cell replaces any explanation, after there are no more distractions, just thoughts. And thinking can be the hardest part. Imagine this for a second. You're alone, no phone, no freedom, no control, and with one single thing occupying your mind. How did I get here? Because there's no escaping that question. It comes back again and again and again. And every time it comes back, the answer becomes clearer and heavier, because deep down, she knows. She knows there was a moment when everything could have been different. Maybe a different choice, maybe a second of hesitation, maybe a simple no. But that moment passed. That matters, because many times when we hear stories like this, the focus goes entirely to the person who committed the act. But there's always another side, the side that had no choice, the side that suffers the consequences without ever being part of the decision. And that changes the perspective, because it removes any possibility of justification. There was no exchange, no clear threat, no evident reason. And when there's no reason, the impact becomes even greater. Now go back to her, because there's a detail that makes everything more intense. Her age, 18 years old, technically an adult, but emotionally still developing, still discovering the world, still building an identity, and that doesn't justify anything, but it explains part of the picture, because impulsive decisions are much more common at that stage. The problem is, some decisions have no way back, and this is one of them. Now imagine the weight of that, knowing that a choice made in seconds will follow you for years, maybe for a lifetime. And no matter how differently you think later, no matter how much you change, the past doesn't change with you. And that's one of the hardest things to accept, because growth doesn't erase consequences. And then there's another point, judgment. Not just legal judgment, but social judgment, because cases like this don't stay inside a room. They spread. People watch, comment, form opinions, and many of those opinions are definitive, without context, without depth, just based on what's visible. And what's visible is a young person involved in something serious, and that creates an image, a narrative. That's very hard to change. But here's something important. Stories like this aren't simple. They don't fit into quick labels, because behind every decision, there's context, a history, influences, relationships, and even silences. But none of that changes the essential. A choice was made, and that choice had consequences, and that's what defines everything. Now think about another detail. The fiancé. He was there too. He was also arrested. And that raises another question. To what extent does one person influence another? Because when two people are together, decisions are rarely individual. There's dynamics, there's influence, there's approval, even if it's silent. And that makes everything even more complex. Because now it's not just about one person, it's about a relationship, and how that relationship may have contributed to what happened. But regardless of that, the result is the same. Two people, one car, one decision, and multiple lives affected. And then we return to that moment, the moment of realization, because all of this, all these layers, all these consequences, they don't appear all at once. They come in waves. First the shock, then the fear, then the understanding, and finally, acceptance. And acceptance is the hardest stage. Because that's when there's no more denial, no more escape, only the truth, and living with the truth can be harder than anything else. Now let me ask you something. If you were in that room, in that moment, knowing everything had already been discovered, what would you do? Would you speak, confess, or stay silent and hoping that somehow things would get better? That's an uncomfortable question, because there's no easy answer. And maybe that's exactly the point, because situations like this aren't made of easy answers. They're made of difficult decisions and inevitable consequences. And in the end, what remains is not just what happened, but what could have been avoided. There's something no one tells you about moments like this. They don't end when the story ends. In fact, that's exactly when they start to echo, because after the arrest, after the charges, after everything comes to light, what remains is what no one sees. The thoughts, the memories, the what-ifs, and those don't go away. Imagine reliving the same scene over and over again. The car, the street, that exact moment, and the unavoidable question, why did I do this? Or maybe worse, why didn't I stop it? Because at some level, she knows. She knows it could have been different, and that awareness is what makes everything even heavier. Now think about how time works in that reality. Out there, the world keeps moving. People go on with their lives. Days pass quickly, but in there, time changes. It slows down. Each day feels longer, each night quieter, and every thought louder. And it's in that environment that reality becomes impossible to ignore, because there's no distraction strong enough to escape yourself. And that leads to another important point, responsibility. Because at some point, every story like this reaches it. It doesn't matter how many versions exist. It doesn't matter how many attempts to explain. There comes a moment when everything comes down to one thing, owning it. But owning it isn't easy, because it means letting go of every defense. It means stopping the justifications, stopping the denial, stopping the escape, and simply saying, this happened. And more than that, I was part of it. That's the turning point, and also the hardest one, because it's where a person stops fighting reality and starts living with it. But there's something even deeper here, something many people ignore. The psychological impact. Because situations like this don't just affect the future, they transform how a person sees themselves. Identity changes, perception changes, the way they understand the world changes, and rebuilding that takes time, a long time. Now, while all of this is happening, there's another side of the story that continues to live the consequences in a different way. The victim, that man who was just trying to survive one more night. He didn't choose to be part of it, but he was included in a brutal and unexpected way. And even though he survived, that doesn't mean everything went back to normal, because experiences like that leave marks, not just physical, but emotional, psychological, and those marks can last far longer than any visible wound. That matters because it reminds us of something essential. Every action has an impact that goes beyond the moment, beyond intention, beyond control, and often it reaches people who should never have been involved. Now go back to that night, to that exact moment. If that car had just passed by without stopping, without any action, none of this would exist. No investigation, no arrest, no story. But that's not what happened, and that's what makes it so hard to accept, because sometimes everything depends on seconds, on quick decisions, on impulses, and those impulses can define years or even a lifetime. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever made an impulsive decision that you later realized you shouldn't have? Something small, something that didn't have major consequences. Now imagine if that moment had been bigger, more intense, more irreversible. That's the difference. And that's what this case lays bare. The line between an ordinary choice and a decision that changes everything is much thinner than it seems. And that's uncomfortable, because it shows that no one is completely distant from this. All of us make decisions. All of us act on impulse sometimes. But the context, the circumstances, and the moment can completely transform the outcome. And that's why stories like this hold attention so strongly. Because they're not just about what happened, they're about what could have been avoided, and about how, in a single moment, everything can spiral out of control. Now, as the case moves forward, new details emerge. The weapons are analyzed, the evidence is organized, statements are cross-checked, and everything begins to form a clearer picture. A picture that no longer depends on versions, but on facts. And facts don't change. They remain. And they're what will define what happens next. And then we reach an inevitable point, The trial, not just the legal one, but the internal one. Because before any external decision, there's an internal one. And that decision is the hardest of all. Accepting who you became in that moment, accepting what happened, and accepting that there's no going back. And when that happens, a new phase begins. A phase where there's no more denial, only reconstruction. But rebuilding never means erasing. It means learning to live with what cannot be changed. And that is something very few people truly understand. There comes a moment when the story stops being about what happened and starts being about what it means. And that's exactly where we are now, because up until this point, you've seen the facts. You've seen the decisions. You've seen the moment everything spiraled out of control. But now comes the part that stays, the impact, because stories like this don't end with a sentence. They continue in people's minds, in the memory of those who lived through it, and most of all, in the conscience of those involved. Now think about this. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. A quick decision, an impulsive moment, but the consequences, those aren't quick, they're long, drawn out, and often permanent. And maybe that's the hardest part to understand. How something so fast can create something so lasting. But that's reality, and that's why this case hits so hard. Because it shows, in a brutal way, the weight of a single moment. Now let's go back to that room. One last time, not physically, but emotionally, because that moment, when she realizes it's over, doesn't end there. It repeats in her mind over and over again, like a constant replay. And every time it comes back, it brings something different. At first, denial. This can't be happening. Then, attempts to justify. Maybe it's not that serious, but over time, that changes and turns into something quieter, deeper. Acceptance. And accepting is not forgetting. It's not moving on. It's simply recognizing. Recognizing that that moment existed, that that decision was real, and that there's no way to erase it. Now let me ask you something important. Do you think people truly understand the weight of their decisions in the moment they're making them, or only after? Because most of the time, it's only after, only when it's already happened, only when there's no way back. And that's one of the most uncomfortable parts of all this. We live as if there's always time to fix things, as if there's always a second chance. But there isn't always, and when there isn't, the impact is final. Now think about another detail, that camera. If it hadn't been there, this story would be different. Maybe it would never have been discovered. Maybe it would never have reached an interrogation room. Maybe none of this would be happening, but it was there. And that changes everything, because the truth, whether we like it or not, comes out, somehow, at some point. And when it does, no matter how much time has passed, it demands its price, and it's a high one. Now let's look at this from another angle, not just as a story, but as a warning. Because what happened here didn't start with that act. It started earlier, with smaller decisions, with behaviors, with influences, with boundaries that kept being crossed little by little, until one day, the boundary simply stopped existing. And that happens more often than people think. Not always in such extreme ways, but in the pattern. Small decisions leading to bigger consequences. And that's why paying attention to those details matters. Because no one wakes up one day and suddenly decides to completely change who they are. That happens gradually, and often without realizing it. Now, as all of this unfolds, one thing becomes clear. It's not just about her. It's not just about him. It's not just about that night. It's about choices, and how choices define paths, and paths define destinations. And that destination was completely altered. Now there is a before and an after, and nothing connects those 2 points in a simple way. Between them, there is a moment, a single moment, that changed everything. And maybe that's the biggest reflection of all. How many moments like that exist in life? Small moments that seem insignificant but carry enormous weight. Moments where one decision defines everything that comes next, and most people don't even realize they're in one of those moments. Now, as we reach the end of this story, there's a strange feeling. It's not just sadness, it's not just shock, it's something more complex, a mix of disbelief and reflection. Because deep down, no one wants to believe that something like this can happen so fast. But it can, and it did. And that changes the way we see things. It changes how we understand decisions, and most importantly, how we perceive consequences. Because in the end, it's not about the mistake itself, it's about its impact. And the impact goes far beyond the moment. Now take a second and think about all of this. If there's one thing this story makes clear, it's that there's no such thing as a neutral decision. Every choice leads somewhere, even if we don't realize it at the time. And some choices take us much farther than we ever imagined, and not always to where we'd want to be. At the end of the day, what stays is not the interrogation, not just the evidence, not even the moment of the arrest. It's that specific second when everything changes. That instant when a person realizes there's no going back. And if you pay attention, this entire story revolves around that. Not the beginning, not the middle, but that moment. Because that's where reality stops being a possibility and becomes final. And maybe that's why this case hits so hard. Because it's not just about what happened, it's about realizing too late. Now imagine this calmly, a whole life ahead, plans, relationships, expectations, everything still being built, and suddenly, a single moment interrupts everything. It doesn't reduce, it doesn't pause, it interrupts and creates a new reality. A reality that wasn't planned, wasn't expected, but now is unavoidable. And that leads to a difficult but necessary reflection. How many decisions in our lives do we make without thinking about the real consequences? How many times do we act on impulse, believing we'll fix it later? How many times does something seem small but isn't? Because the problem isn't just making mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The problem is when the mistake can't be undone. And that's exactly the point here. There's no going back, no redo, no try again. There's only moving forward with what's already been done, and that changes everything. Now think about something else. If you were watching this story from the outside, without context, without details, just seeing what happened, what would your judgment be? Quick, direct, without nuance. But when you understand the process, when you see the step-by-step, when you realize how everything unfolded, the feeling changes. It doesn't excuse it, but it deepens it, because it shows that stories like this don't come out of nowhere. They're built, decision after decision, moment after moment, until one day there's no stopping it. And maybe that's the biggest lesson here. Pay attention to the small moments, because they're the ones that build the big ones. Now go back with me to that interrogation. Remember her initial posture, the calm, the attempt to seem composed. That wasn't just strategy, it was denial. It was the mind trying to protect itself from something it wasn't ready to accept yet. But the truth doesn't need your acceptance to exist. It simply exists. And when it shows up, no matter how much you try to avoid it, it imposes itself. And that's exactly what happened. The truth came out, and with it, everything collapsed. Now, at the end of this story, what remains goes beyond the case. What remains is a warning, not about crime, not about investigation, but about decisions. About how seemingly small moments can carry enormous consequences, and how sometimes we only understand that when it's already too late. And maybe the most important question is this: if you were in that moment, in her place, what would you do differently? Would you have noticed? Would you have stopped? Would you have avoided it? Or would you only understand after? That's the uncomfortable part, because there's no guaranteed answer. And that's what makes it real. Now, as this story continues on its path, with trials, consequences, and outcomes, one thing is already defined. Nothing will change what happened. Nothing will erase that moment. Nothing will undo that choice. And that is permanent. But here's something important. Stories like this don't exist just to shock. They exist to remind us that decisions matter, that impulses carry weight, and that there isn't always a second chance.